From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power with David Weston.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Well, today is the day for that runoff election down in Georgia to decide on their second senator. And we're going to go now to the site itself of Georgia. And our intrepid Washington correspondent, Joe Matthew, he's host of Sound On weekdays on Bloomberg Radio. So I want to start, you're not the weather guy, but what's the weather like down there? Because it could affect turnout, I suppose, Joe.
Yeah, it's really, in many ways, the most important story of the day here, David, remembering the record early turnout that we saw, one that favored Democrats in a lot of areas here in the state of Georgia, and has put a bit of a burden on Herschel Walker, the Republican, of course, to try to put a dent in that early vote by getting people to turn out today. Here are both candidates making their election eve closing arguments.
Get your friends to vote. Call your friends to vote. This is so important. And I say this, if you don't have friends, what do you need to do? Make some friends and get them out to vote.
We saw record voter turnout during the early vote period. But I don't want you to underestimate our opposition. After all, these are the folk who tried to stop us from having Saturday voting.
Senator Warnock referring to the lawsuit his campaign won to secure an additional day of early voting. I was talking earlier with one of the officials here at this polling site. This is the Ponce de Leon Library in Atlanta behind me. He told me at 6:30 this morning the line went all the way to the end of this block, which is what we saw every day over the course of the 2 weeks of early voting. People are at work now, and some questions again, David, about the weather. It's spitting right now. It's been foggy, cloudy the last couple of days. We expect more of that today. So will people take the time to stand in line on their way home tonight? One of the big questions, and it's not just for Herschel Walker. Senator Warnock last night at his election eve rally was pleading with people to not be complacent. Don't read into these stories. If you haven't voted yet, he said, vote like it's an emergency, David.
So, Joe, take us forward now to this evening and what we can expect. As I understand, there have been an awful lot of early votes cast. When do they start counting those? Yep. When will I have a result on those? And do we have any sense when we might get an actual answer to who won?
These are all great questions, and we're asking all of these same questions. They will start counting those votes at 7 when the polls close. It's a question, though, remembering a lot of those votes were cast in person as opposed to provisional or mail-in ballots, absentee ballots, and so forth. It's a question of how close this is, though. If Herschel Walker can mobilize the troops, we may be here tomorrow wondering who won. If this is a decisive victory for either of these candidates, I've had some members of both parties telling me that we could get a call tonight, David. So you'll have to tune in for our coverage. We'll keep you posted.
Well, we certainly will be tuning in for your coverage. Thank you so much to Joe Matthew. You get Joe on Sound On. It's 5 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Radio. In the meantime, whoever really gets to go to the Senate from Georgia, they're going to be in a Congress that faces a weakening economy over the next year or so, something Goldman Sachs CEO David Solomon had described to Bloomberg's Shonali Basak earlier today.
We're at a very uncertain time, given we're changing monetary and economic conditions very, very quickly. And that's certainly having an impact of slowing down economic activity. And so if you're running a big financial services firm, I think you have to assume that we have some bumpy times ahead. We could see a recession in 2023 also. And so I think you've got to be cautious and prepare.
And to take us through those economic and financial conditions we just heard about, we turn now to Glenn Hubbard. He's professor and dean emeritus of the Columbia Business School. Dr. Hubbard served as the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under President George W. Bush and is the author of The Wall and the Bridge, Fear and Opportunity in Disruption's Wake. So, Glenn, thank you so much for being back with us. You heard him say it's pretty uncertain. Give us your take on the economic conditions right now. How uncertain are they?
Well, it is uncertain. I think it's still likely that we will see a recession if the Federal Reserve pursues its path to get to 2% inflation relatively quickly. Getting to 4 is straightforward through supply chain fixes, rental price inflation declines, and so on. But given the wage pressures, I think the Fed will have to destroy demand. And I think equity markets haven't really priced that in yet. There are also huge implications for President Biden fiscally of the higher interest rates that are accompanying the Fed's actions. So a lot of uncertainties, Mr. Solomon said.
So we heard actually from Jay Powell, the chairman of the Fed, just a few days ago, saying exactly what you said, which is we've got a gap on the employment side where we've got a lot more jobs open than people seeking those jobs. We have to destroy some of the demand, at least for labor. How do you go about doing that, and how fast does that happen? Because one question is not just whether we've peaked on inflation, but how far do we come down the other side?
Well, it's a very good question, and in fact is the question facing Chair Powell and his colleagues. Destroying demand will really require the Fed to continue to raise interest rates and to keep the level of interest rates higher than perhaps markets thought a year or so ago. But Milton Friedman's famous aphorism that monetary policy works with long and variable lags is true. And what's uncertain for Chair Powell and his colleagues is how long it will take what they've already done to have an effect. I do expect we'll see recessionary pressures in 2023. I strongly suspect the Fed feels that way too. It's possible to have a soft landing without a recession, but not really and get to 2% quickly.
So one of the things we heard from Chair Powell when he did address the question of the labor situation was it's not so important what the rate of increase is, because he essentially signaled, I believe, 50 basis points next time. That's not so important as where the terminal level is for interest rates. We don't know where that is. I wonder what you think about that. We talked to your friend and colleague Larry Summers on Friday on Wall Street Week. He said we may well be talking with something like it starts with a 6.
Well, you're talking about for the federal funds rate?
Yeah.
I think somewhere in the 5 strikes me as probably more likely. The question is how long the Fed has to hold that. It could possibly be as high as 6%. Longer term bonds are telling us, of course, they don't expect that to remain for long. We shall see. What worries me a little is the politics. You were speaking of a new Congress, of will the Fed be able to stick to its guns in getting down to 2 relatively quickly? I expect there to be a lot of political flack.
Well, let's turn to that exactly, because we do have a new Congress coming in. We know there's going to be a fairly narrow majority of Republicans in the House. We know there's going to be an effective majority in the Senate without regard to actually whether Raphael Warnock has returned. If you were back in the White House in your old job, what would you be advising the president about what he can and cannot get accomplished on the economic policy front going forward?
Well, it's a very good question. I think it's unlikely the president's going to get a lot of his agenda accomplished. But I think he can do 2 big things. One is tell more of a story about the economy, which would require more of a theory of the case for the short term and the long term than the administration has told so far. He also has to be acknowledging the fiscal challenges. If you raise the level of interest rates on government debt by 2 percentage points across the board, that's a $500 billion a year increase in debt service. And so there's some constraints that the new Congress and the president have to deal with. The president could get out ahead of those, or he could be overwhelmed by them.
Well, take me through that if you can, Glenn. When you talk about the constraints imposed, we have the bipartisan infrastructure bill. I guess they've committed to that money. We have what's in the Infrastructure Reduction Act, whatever you want to call it. That's been committed to. So I guess those are fixed costs, as it were. What are the variable costs that you have constraints on?
Well, I think the president has signaled an interest in doing additional changes in social programs. I think that's going to be very hard in this budget environment. Investing more in skills in communities is probably needed, but could be paid for by changes elsewhere in the budget. So I think the president's going to have to talk more, and frankly, so will Republicans in the Congress, much more about budgets than they have in the past.
And Glenn, I wonder, you've mentioned short-term and longer-term questions with economic policy. And the short-term we'll have to deal with as it comes. But what about longer-term? And that takes me back to your book, The Wall and the Bridge. At some point, we will come out of the difficulty that we anticipate in 2023. I don't know when that is, but we will. What can the president, what should the president do to prepare us for a longer-term pattern of growth?
Well, it's a very good question. I think he could do a couple of things. One is to move forward in the possibilities for growth, which would be a lot more support for research and the location of research centers around the country to make sure that gets into business practice. The other is to really up our game on preparing Americans of all skill levels for the work of the future. This can be done in a lot of work with firms, with local governments, community colleges, and so on. But it would require a rethink of the president's approach. But he's got an ideal opportunity to do it. in a way that needn't be partisan.
We have to get the people ready for the new world, the people that we have already. Do we need more people? And I guess that takes me back to immigration, something we talk about all the time. I hear from a lot of economists, look, we've got to address immigration issues as well if we're really going to have long-term economic growth.
We do. It's been a secret sauce for America's strength for a very long time. The immigration debate has both high skill and low skill components. High skills should be easy. We should want every high skilled worker who wants to be an American and skilled to be here. Low skilled is a matter of having a conversation about training for Americans as well. But both of those need to be on the table. The labor shortages throughout the economy are really palpable.
So, Glenn, you're not a politician that I'm aware of. You are an economist, after all. But talk about the high skill, low skill, because as I recall, former President Trump proposed something along the lines of the high skill, did he not? With specific targeted visas being admitted. Why can there not be bipartisan support for that part, even if the low skilled is more complicated?
Well, I think it's still difficult politically to pull those apart in the way that President Trump was trying to do. I think that we do have to have a broad conversation about the value of immigration to the economy, the value of immigrant entrepreneurs, of immigrant ideas, of immigrant work for our country, and then talk about ways we're preparing Americans to succeed alongside that. Sometimes you have to have that conversation first.
Okay, Glenn, it's always such a pleasure to have you with us. That is Glenn Hubbard, who's professor and dean emeritus of the Columbia Business School. Coming up, we go back to Georgia for the views of Emory political science professor Andra Gillespie. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on Bloomberg Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We are all focused on Georgia today, where they are holding the election, that runoff election for the United States Senate, and people have gone to the polls, at least those who haven't already voted early. To take us through the lay of the land down there in Georgia, we welcome now Andra Gillespie. She is Associate Professor of Political Science at Emory University. Professor, thank you so much for being back with us. So give us a sense overall of Georgia politically right now. We keep hearing it's a swing state. Was that borne out in the midterms?
It was borne out in the closeness of this particular race. If we look at the other statewide contests, Republicans won their races very handily. And so that does actually call into question how well Democrats can do when, Donald Trump or Donald Trump identified candidates are not on the ballot. And so I think that's a question that's still going to take a few years to settle. But the fact that we are in a runoff between Raphael Warnock and Herschel Walker, and that Herschel Walker didn't win this race handily, suggests that there are weaknesses that Democrats can exploit to be able to be successful in some statewide contests. They may not have had the numbers to be able to do that 10, 15 years ago, but the fact that they can do this and that they're within striking distance now, I think does lend credence to the idea that Georgia is more competitive than it used to be. Whether it's purple or pink, I think is still an open question.
So, of course, we don't know the results. It may end up being close or not so close. The polling indicates it is close, and certainly, as you just suggested, closer than one might have thought, given the fact that Herschel Walker seemed to have some flaws, let me put it that way, as a candidate. So explain that. Was that a matter of the issues? Are there issues that, in fact, Georgia voters tend to vote more Republican on than Democrat? Because I'm not sure it was the candidates themselves.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of this race has to do with candidate quality. The issues in this race have been nationalized, and we have seen both candidates actually try to sort of fall in line with their national parties. So when Herschel Walker has talked about issues, he has certainly talked about them in a national context, trying to tie Raphael Warnock to Joe Biden, who is net unfavorable in the state. He has certainly, leaned into cultural issues in an attempt to try to rile up the base to ensure high voter turnout amongst his base. And Raphael Warnock has run a campaign where he's talked about bipartisanship. So that's the local kind of angle on this, that he recognizes that he's in a state where there are more conservatives than there would be in a state like California or New York, for instance. But he has still, hewed toward party lines on social issues like abortion. And emphasized that in terms of his outreach to female voters in particular, who may be angered by the Dobbs decision.
So, Professor Gillespie, you make a really, I think, interesting point that it really has a lot to do with the quality of the candidates, and we've heard a lot about the quality of Herschel Walker, or perhaps some people would say lack of quality. But it appears, at least, that Raphael Warnock has not sealed the deal with Georgia voters yet. Now, he's only been there 2 years, in fairness to him. But what has he done for Georgia, or what could he have done to really have put this away against Herschel Walker before now?
So I think it's important to realize that despite the fact that Warnock is the incumbent in this race and he does have some resources and advantages that came along with having been in the office for almost 2 years now, he's still the underdog. Georgia Democrats still don't have the same numbers as Republicans do. So there's still more Republicans than there are Democrats in the state. And so he was the one that was still at a disadvantage. That's why he started raising money early and started raising a lot of it. Because while it wasn't going to be impossible for him to be able to win, it was still going to be more difficult and challenging. It wasn't a foregone conclusion that he was going to be able to hold on to this seat. I think one of the reasons why we're in the race that we're in right now has an awful lot to do with the fact that Herschel Walker, proved to be a weak candidate. If, say, the second place primary finisher Gary Black had run, I think that there is a case to arguably be made that he could have ridden Brian Kemp's coattails to defeating Raphael Warnock. So we are in the position where we are in because Herschel Walker just proved to be a less than ideal candidate. And Raphael Warnock was strong enough to be able to supplant that. And he's been able to put in a mobilization operation that can actually go toe to toe with the Republicans' mobilization operation. And we'll see the fruits of that today. So ultimately, it's which candidate has the least erosion in terms of the turnout of their particular base today that's going to end up being the one that wins.
Professor Gillespie, for those of us of a certain age, this certainly excludes you, but includes me, it might be remarkable that we have 2 black men running for Senate from Georgia. There was a day that would have been pretty exceptional. Is this historically significant or not? Or maybe we've made that much progress as a country?
So it is and it isn't. So I don't think it's surprising that you will see 2 black candidates running for statewide office like U.S. Senate in the Deep South. In fact, this was the case this cycle in South Carolina, and this is not the first time that Senator Tim Scott has faced a black Democratic opponent. I mean, I think what's unusual is having the black Republican opponent there to counter the black Democratic opponent, which, while still unusual, is not unprecedented. And I think it's also important to remember that when Barack Obama ran for the U.S. Senate, his eventual Republican opponent was a black man, Alan Keyes. So it certainly says something about descriptive representation. It reflects in the Deep South the demographics of the state. So when you have a state that's 30% African American, if the Republicans nominate a black person, it wouldn't be unusual for the Democrats to be doing that all along because they've got a deeper bench of potential candidates from which to run. I think the lesson in this contest is that these 2 candidates are very different from one another. And so while they may share a common racial identity and may have some experiences that are similar to one another, their approach to addressing issues, generally speaking, and even issues related to race are very, very different. So we would have a conversation if Herschel Walker were to win in the African American community about whether that we would agree that this is descriptive representation, but there would probably be about 90% of Georgia black voters who would argue that it's not substantive representation because they don't expect Herschel Walker to champion their issues in the way that they would want them to be championed.
One last one, if I could, Professor Gillespie, because obviously former President Trump has something of a history with politics in Georgia. It hasn't always worked out his way, whether it was the last runoff election we had, whether it was Governor Kemp this time, and how he tried to unseat him, and now we'll find out how it works out with Raphael Warnock and Herschel Walker. What is the future of influence for Donald Trump in Georgia, or can we say?
So, I mean, I think in general, we are going to look at Donald Trump's influence overall and whether or not key national Republicans are willing to stand up to him and publicly disagree with him when he makes decisions that they disagree with, or if he says things that are unconstitutional, like he suggested this weekend on Truth Social. I think the larger issue and the lesson of 2022 is that Donald Trump's strategy for picking candidates wasn't actually based in anything empirical. He chose candidates based on loyalty. He chose candidates based on telegenics and popularity, not necessarily on substance. And where these candidates were weak, they faltered. Where these candidates were extreme, there was pushback. And so I think as a result of this, we want to see how long Republicans sustain their willingness to stand up to Donald Trump when he says things to them that are sort of textbook nonsensical.
Okay, Professor, it's always great to have you. This has been very, very helpful. That's Andrea Gillespie, Professor of Political Science at Emory University. Still to come, we're going to get to talk to former New York Governor George Pataki, who has just returned from Ukraine. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on Bloomberg Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It's time now to get a check on the markets, which may just be waiting for what happens next week with the Fed. But we'll get an answer from Abigail Doolittle. So where are we today?
Well, it's interesting because we are looking at a pretty big down day. And at this point, we're session lows. The S&P 500 down 1.3%. The NASDAQ 100 down 1.7%. A fourth down day in a row. The longest losing streak since the beginning of November. The worst losing streak since the beginning of November. You know, it's not entirely clear what's behind this. So it's appealing what you just said in terms of folks waiting for next week in the FOMC. I would also say last week, if you recall, Wednesday when Jay Powell spoke, there was that big rally. So it's a bit of a giving back of that. You know, at the time, it seemed he said nothing new. In fact, if anything, he said longer and higher, just slower. The markets liked it, maybe now reconsidering, especially given the ISM print that was good and good jobs data.
Well, so let me put you on the spot, because you always say ultimately it's about the Fed. Ultimately it's about the Fed.
It always
At this point, we're pretty sure we think we know what the Fed's going to do next week, don't we? It's 50 basis points. So if that's true, then what are the markets trading on?
I think it's less about next week. And I think that was actually what happened last week, where it seemed locked in that it would be 50 basis points. And will they give any color on next year? Because the last time that I looked or heard that there's a greater than 50-50 chance that they will be raising in February by 50 basis points. Prior, it had been 25 basis points. There's a lot of people, and I think even WARP, I have to look, is talking about some kind of a cut next year. It would be very surprising to me, just based on what I've heard. They have not said anything about cutting. They're talking about a higher terminal rate.
Reverse. Don't cut
exactly. So but the markets seem to want to hear. You know, we've had an accommodative Fed now for 10, 15 years, and it's taking a long time for some of these traders to get on board to the idea that they are actually doing what they're saying they're doing.
I have to ask you about oil. What's going on with oil? Oil's down today.
It is down.
But China's coming back, we think. They're sort of easing up with their COVID-19. So what's that about?
Yeah, and China, that could be a really positive story at some point. That could actually offset a potential recession here in the U.S., just if that demand came on. But that will be longer term. On the day, relative to your question about oil, it is down. WTI down 3.2%, back at $74 per barrel. Brent crude, European crude, down below 80. This, of course, after the Russian price caps were put in at 60. I now have read that Russia is thinking about putting in floors. The OPEC Plus put the pause on whether or not to output, just in terms of they don't know what's going to happen with oil price. It seems traders don't. So here we are stuck between, let's call it 70 and 80.
And there are photos of those Russian tankers, the tankers lined up in the Bosphorus because they won't let them through because they don't know if they have insurance or not.
Oh, I didn't know that about the insurance, but I was reading
Turkey
about.
said you can't go through if you don't have insurance. And
were those the tankers to go out to Asia that they were hoping to find buyers? Yeah, it's interesting.
Thanks so much to Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle. And this is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We want to keep you up to date with news from all around the world. And for that, we turn to Mark Crumpton here with the first word.
David, thank you. As we've been reporting, it is runoff day in Georgia, where voters will decide between Democratic Senator, the incumbent, Raphael Warnock, or his Republican challenger, Herschel Walker, the former football star handpicked by Donald Trump. Polls show Warnock with a slight edge. The race will determine whether Democrats expand their thin majority in the U.S. Senate. The House committee investigating the January 6th attack on the Capitol will recommend some criminal prosecutions. Chairman Benny Thompson told reporters the panel is still working out details. He wouldn't say who could face charges. In Colorado Springs, the suspect in a deadly shooting at a gay bar was formally charged today with hate crimes as well as murder. 5 people were killed and 17 others were wounded in that attack. Anderson Lee Aldrich has not yet entered a plea or spoken about the case. Russia says a third airfield has come under attack by drones. State-run TASS news service reported that an oil storage tank caught fire after the drone attack at a Kursk region airfield. 2 long-range bombers were damaged in Monday's attacks. Ukraine hasn't confirmed it carried out any of the strikes. The attacks were the furthest penetration yet on Russian soil since the invasion began. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Thanks so much, Mark. We want to stay on that subject of Ukraine and welcome somebody who's just back from Ukraine. He's George Pataki, who, of course, has served for 3 terms as the 53rd governor of the state of New York. Governor, thank you so much for being with us. Tell us about your trip. I'm really curious. What was the purpose of the trip? Who'd you go with?
Well, David, the last time I was there, I met and spoke with President Zelensky's wife and asked her what they needed. And she said that they needed power and heat. So what we did this time was we brought in 15 industrial-sized generators, just massive generators, capable of heating tens of thousands of people. And it was just something that the people of Ukraine desperately need. Not enough is happening. You see that Russia is barbarically attacking civilian infrastructure, trying to keep the power off and keep people from being warm in the winter. So my little charity, the George Pataki Center, is going to continue to try to do what we can to help the people of Ukraine through this brutal winter.
So, of course, Governor, we have heard about those attacks, missile and other attacks on power facilities in Ukraine. They appear to be trying to basically freeze out the Ukrainian people during the winter. Do you have a sense of how big the need might be and whether it's possible for the world to supply it? Your charity, but we're going to need, I suspect, more than your charity.
Exactly right, David. What we've done is a small amount of what Ukraine needs. You see it all over the country that the power is out and people are without heat. What President Zelensky is doing is setting up what he calls resiliency centers, where people can go if they don't have power, if they don't have heat, where they can go get warm and charge their phones and organize their lives before they head back into a place that's extremely cold in the winter. But they need not just 10 times what we need, they probably need hundreds of times what we need with our generators. And that's one of the disappointments, is we haven't seen the large-scale humanitarian aid coming from the U.S., despite all the billions that have been appropriated, which is why we're going to continue to do what we can to provide help to the people of Ukraine. Well, we have another 100 generators coming. We have 200 more heaters coming. And we're going to do what we can, but we need massive Western assistance through this to get the Ukrainian people through this winter.
Governor, that sounds like a big challenge. It may also be an opportunity, because I must say, from my point of view, I've heard a lot, as you referred to, about the U.S. government supplying billions and billions in military and other aid. But I haven't heard a lot of calls for the private sector, private charities and others, to pitch in. Is that something that we should be doing, whether it's President Biden or more broadly in NATO, really calling for private enterprise to try to help?
David, I think absolutely yes. We've done it with our little charity. We've worked with the Appeal of Conscience, which is a New York-based charity as well. And ultimately, the government should be filling this role. But in their absence, somebody has to do it. And that's why we're doing it. And to the extent there are private sector players out there that have the ability to access generators or heaters, they're desperately needed. They're not needed in next spring. They're needed now by the people of Ukraine.
Governor, talking about the U.S. aid that continues, and there are requests, obviously, from President Zelensky and others to expand that aid, we now have a change coming in Congress in the House side, and it appears that your party, the Republicans, will have a narrow majority in the House. To what extent do you think that aid may be curtailed or slowed down? Because there are some people, as you know, who are serving in Congress on the Republican side who've raised questions about the aid.
Well, there are people on both sides, David. As you know, a group of, I think it was 15 or 16 so-called progressive members of the House Democratic Caucus actually sent a letter questioning the aid and then withdrew that letter. I think what I'm seeing is that we're not asking U.S. government to appropriate more humanitarian aid. They've appropriated billions. What we're asking for is, where is that aid? Why do we not see it in Ukraine itself? So I think it's appropriate for both parties to take a look and do a deep dive into where those funds are. Is it federal bureaucracy that's not getting them out? Why are they not getting to the people who desperately need them? So it's not as though military is different. They do need continual military funding, and I think we'll have bipartisan support for that. But on the humanitarian side, what happened to the billions that have already been appropriated? Where is it? I think both parties we'll ask that question and take a look at it, and I think that's appropriate.
Is that an executive branch function or a legislative branch function? I mean, you ran the
It's an
state of New York. You distributed aid. How do you make sure that there is accountability when you have big aid?
It's the executive branch function to get the money out the door. But to the extent it's not happening, then the legislative branch has the power to investigate, ask the questions, and ultimately hold the executive accountable if they're not getting the funding out the door. You know, this is our 5th trip to Ukraine, David. It's not pleasant to spend time in December in Ukraine when you don't have power, when you have air raid sirens going off. And we're continuing to hope every time we go there that, here's all the U.S. promised aid. We don't have to do this again. But we haven't seen it. And I think Congress should take a look, ask the questions. Where is it? Who has gotten it? And do we need more? I don't think we need more U.S. funding. I just think we need it to get out the door and to the people who are promised this aid.
Let's turn to the question of politics more generally. When we last talked to you, it was before the midterm elections. I think it's fair to say that in the state of New York, unlike a lot of other places around the country, Democrats did not do as well as they thought they would. Republicans did somewhat better. The Republicans made some gains in the congressional delegation. What did you make about what happened in New York in the midterms?
Well, I think in New York, we saw the 4 seats that had been Democratic for the House of Representatives flip and go with the Republicans. And I think in significant part, not just in New York, but around the country, David, we had 2 different stories. If you were a Trump candidate whose focus is that the elections in 2020 were stolen, you're not going to win in a place like New York, and you're not going to win in a place like Pennsylvania or New Hampshire either. And we saw that across the country. But in New York, I think Republicans have the understanding that we're a party based on principle. That principle has to appeal not just to a partisan group, but to the future and people across the partisan divide. And I think that's one of the reasons why New York was successful. New York Republicans were successful in picking up these 4 new House seats.
Does this tell us something about the future influence of the former President of the United States, Donald Trump, and the Republican Party? Are we starting to see that wane, given the performance that you've described quite accurately?
David, I certainly hope so. I think when you look at his hand-picked candidates that largely got the nomination because he endorsed them and campaigned for them, losing across the country, any intelligent Republican takes a look and says, this is not the person who should be leading our party or our country come 2024. So I hope that we are seeing a new wave of future leaders. There are a lot of great potential candidates out there, governors from across the country. And I would hope that the Republican voters and leaders would take a look and say it's time to move on.
Okay, Governor, it's always a real pleasure to have you with us. Truly appreciate your time. That's former New York Governor George Pataki. Coming up, we're going to talk with former U.S. Ambassador to the European Union, Anthony Gardner, about Ukraine, U.S.-Europe trade tensions, and a common approach to China. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Well, relations between the United States and the European Union have always been terribly important, but never more so than now, particularly in light of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. To take us through those U.S.-EU relations, welcome now Anthony Gardner. He was the former ambassador to the European Union from the United States. So, Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for being with us. Appreciate it. First of all, just on Ukraine specifically, what do we know about what's going on right now? I've seen some reports today, for example, that reportedly, and Ukraine has not admitted to it, there are some attacks inside Russia now.
Yes, I saw that news. I will just say that the U.S. and the EU have done much more than we did back in 2014 and 2015. And I was at Post in Brussels, as you mentioned, as the U.S. ambassador to the EU. I should just tell your viewers that we've gone very far, much further than we did back then in terms of biting sanctions, some so-called sectoral economic sanctions, which are going to have an impact on Russia, no doubt, in terms of its ability to have technologically leading-edge industries. And already they're feeling the bite right now. So it's something we can be proud of, for sure.
And it appears thus far, to the outside world at least, that we are almost joined at the hip with our European allies on a lot of these things. Is there a risk to that we saw a little peak of, perhaps, when President Macron from France came over to visit last week with President Biden, coming out of the trade dispute involving the Inflation Reduction Act and subsidies for electric vehicles that are tied to U.S. manufacture?
Well, you're absolutely right. So it's a good question. You know, we've gone a long way to repair what I would say is the damage caused by President Trump during those 4 years. And I say that because we've reestablished good relations with the EU and we've made very clear our support for NATO. And this Ukraine crisis has really done a lot in that direction. But there are frictions. There's no doubt there are frictions. And I can tell you, living in Europe for a very long time, the last 22 years or so, there is a sense of panic in Europe right now, in terms of what I would call the sucking sound of jobs from Europe to the United States. And it's in that context, indeed, that many European leaders, including President Macron, his visit, said, look, this Inflation Reduction Act is, to one extent, it's great because the United States is taking climate change seriously, but you're throwing a lot of money, a lot of subsidies, and it's being done in a protectionist way, in a way that Europe considers to be not compliant with WTO rules. And that message was received, and apparently we're going to try to do what we can within the contours of legislation to make it less difficult to swallow. But the answer to Europe cannot be, you guys should just pass your own IRA, your own subsidies, because that's not the way Europe works. The EU doesn't have a budget to do it. The COVID-related stimulus plan of the EU was considered to be a one-off and probably will be. And the member states who can afford to do it are few, particularly Germany, and they can't do it because that would undermine the single market. So we shouldn't just say to Europe, you just do what we did. And that can't be the answer, because we should not be going in the direction of competing subsidies and outspending each other. We should be cooperating, especially on Ukraine and also on China.
So that's EU-U.S. trade relations. Talk about China, and particularly the United States with Europe with respect to China, because one of the issues that came up under President Trump was the suggestion that maybe we should be trying to get our allies together with us rather than doing this bilaterally with China. Where are we with that arrangement? Because obviously much of Europe, as I understand it, is more dependent upon China for trade than the United States is.
Absolutely. Look, we're moving in the right direction. I can tell you, 5 to 10 years ago, Europe and the EU institutions were very far away from our view with regard to China in terms of our skepticism, our concerns. Part of that is structural. Look, we have much more at stake in the Asia Pacific than most European countries do. France is perhaps an exception. So we feel much more strongly about it. The second issue is that some European countries, particularly Germany, very specifically tied their economic model to exports to China, and still some very large German companies have a very high exposure in terms of their percentage of total exports to that country. But we're moving in the right direction. Now, the Ukraine crisis reminded people in the United States, including this administration, that Europe and the EU actually count and can put some unique tools and work with us on key issues. And not only with regard to Russia, but with regard to China. And here I'm thinking about export controls, I'm talking about foreign direct investment, I'm talking about secondary sanctions. Even on China, Europe really is an essential partner for the United States. I think that message is going through. Now, if we're going to collaborate, including in the Trade and Technology Council, which was set up several years ago and just had its latest meeting, on the topics I mentioned, we should not be at loggerheads on issues like electric vehicles.
Electric vehicles do raise the question of climate. There's another aspect of trade that is being reported. The United States is interested in talking with the EU, maybe implementing a tariff with respect to Chinese steel and aluminum tied to carbon usage. What do you know about that? Does that make sense?
Well, I would like to see that happen because it would be meaningful. It's been talked about already for a while, but if we can implement a common tariff on our borders for dirty goods, dirty meaning high carbon intensive goods, say steel and cement and other products like that, it would be a good start because it would show we're serious about the climate. We have two of the largest markets in the world. The EU obviously is a very large single market. The United States is extremely large. Together, we can impose our standards and prevent leakage. Let's say, by that I mean companies leaving the United States and Europe to produce their goods elsewhere, and instead keep out dirty, high carbon products from polluting countries.
In success, does this apply to more than just China?
It does, sure. I mean, there are countries who are exporting those goods to the United States in large amounts, but China really is the biggest source of concern.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Really good to have you with us today. That's Anthony Gardner. He's former U.S. Ambassador to the European Union. Thanks so much for your time. Coming up, we're going to go to Capitol Hill for an update on the lame duck session of Congress. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Well, in case you lost track of it, Congress is very much in session, and it's called a lame duck session before the new Congress comes in next year. And to bring us up to speed on exactly what they're working on Capitol Hill, we welcome now Zach Cohen. He is Bloomberg congressional reporter. So, Zach, thanks so much for being with us. I mean, the big one is funding the government, right? They've got a deadline of the 16th, but what else are they working on?
Right, so they've got to fund the government and come up with some sort of either a stopgap vehicle or a full-year government funding bill. Still trying to work out an agreement on those top-line deals, basically how much money would go to each individual sector of the federal government. But they've got a whole host of other issues they're working on in the meantime. Things like the National Defense Authorization Act, the annual military policy bill that's passed for something like 60 years in a row. They've got a same-sex marriage bill that's passed the Senate and is waiting in the House for some action sometime this week. A couple of other things that they'd like to get done, but Democrats are really counting down the days here before they lose control of the House and therefore unified control of Washington.
So Zach, insofar as we know, what's holding them up on the Defense Authorization Act? I mean, they've always done that, right? I mean, no matter how long it takes. But what's holding them up? Why can't they just do it?
Yeah, it's not so much the actual military policy issues at this point. It's a lot of riders that has created some issues. Kevin McCarthy was on Fox News the other day talking about how they managed to get inserted a measure that would lift the requirement that members of the military get the COVID-19 vaccine. And that's something obviously some Democrats would like to keep in place for obvious reasons in order to control the pandemic as it is still ongoing. There are some other riders that are trying to get involved. Senator Joe Manchin has a permitting reform measure that he'd like to get included in there, which Republicans don't think is quite strong enough in order to truly change permitting procedure. Once they manage to manage those riders, once leadership is able to say we've cleared the decks, we've gotten all of that done, then they can pass this bill, which would actually authorize more spending on the military than what the Biden administration has even asked for, $45 billion over that initial ask. So it's a rather robust bill, and again, something that's usually bipartisan, but also something that does tend to be something of a Christmas tree for various ornaments that lawmakers want to tack on.
Zach, I guess I have a similar question about the so-called Respect for Marriage Act that has been pending. There seems to be bipartisan support for it. I think that now Senate has passed it, if I'm not mistaken, and now it's back over to the House. What's holding that up?
Yeah, so it did pass the Senate with 12 Republican votes. All 50 Democrats supported it. Senator Raphael Warnock missed one of the votes on that while he was stumping down in Georgia for re-election in that election that's actually happening today for the runoff. It does have bipartisan support and probably will in the House as well. The issue is really procedural at this point. There was a Rules Committee meeting last night that didn't include it, despite being, telling all of us that they were planning on putting that and sort of gearing up for floor consideration as soon as today. That hasn't happened and likely won't happen, so it could come up Wednesday or Thursday, and we're hoping to get a little more information about that in the coming hours. This bill would basically do two things. It would repeal the Defense of Marriage Act in the Clinton administration, as well as basically create a federal protection for same-sex marriage. It wouldn't codify the Obergefell decision, the Supreme Court decision that essentially created a federal right to a same-sex marriage, but it would make sure that people who are in same-sex marriages now basically can continue to hold on to those rights regardless of what the Supreme Court might do.
Okay, one last one, and that is the Electoral Count Act, that again, I understood was largely bipartisan.
Yeah, that's a bipartisan measure being led by people like Senator Susan Collins and Joe Manchin that would basically try to prevent what happened on January 6th, not so much the insurrection, but the effort to reject electoral ballots from the states like Arizona and Pennsylvania. It would basically raise the bar and make it harder to raise those objections. So in a truly catastrophic turn where the result of the election had to be overturned, there was still a mechanism in order to do that. But it sort of makes it harder to do. Right now, you only need one member of the House and one member of the Senate to agree to both object to the same state. And it sort of raises the requirements in order to be able to do that. And that does have to have bipartisan support. Just a question of finding some floor time or a legislative vehicle.
Zach, you got some busy days ahead of you. Thank you so much. That's Zach Cohen reports on Congress for Bloomberg. Check out the Balance of Power newsletter on the Journal and online. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we're going to talk to former U.S. Trade Representative Carla Hills about Biden's trade policy. And this is Bloomberg.